Godspeed, the alternate history mod coming out for Hearts of Iron 4 later in 2020, supposedly. But what is its premise? What is its deal, you know? That is a question that has perplexed the minds of Redditors for years and driven the dev team to near insanity every time it is posed. Luckily for these two groups, I'm here to give a vague concept of what I remember about it in video format. So, let's get into it, shall we? Now, unlike less popular alternate history scenarios, the Godspeed world doesn't really have a set point of departure where you can trace the wackiness to one event that didn't happen in our timeline. Instead, things just kind of start drifting allo-historically independently from each other, creating a smorgasbord of geopolitics, of which we will jump into after a little context. Context such as Godspeed was once a high fantasy mod, not even set on Earth. Also, I think it was horny. I try not to think about it.
So, the modern edition of Godspeed started with the different prompt of, hey, what if in this hoi4 mod, colonialism failed? And the mod sticks with this premise pretty well for the most part, with its first nation-run states, a wealthy Islamic world, and a industrial China, all in 1934. As mentioned, the mod justifies the lore it has created not by having one point of departure where one specific event goes differently, but instead it lets the writers take what must be a much more freeing approach of just having everything gradually shift a bit starting in the Middle Ages. 1. The Nords and the Chinese show up in the New World in around the year 1000 and spread their diseases to the indigenous folk. This makes the first wave of everyone dying happen 400 years earlier and immunizing two continents before the non-Viking Europeans can even show up. 2. Islam in general has shifted west. There's a sultanate controlling majority of Italy up to the Rubicon. The religion maintains a grasp on Iberia, and Iberia colonized Brazil in exchange for half as many Muslims in India and Indonesia, a vastly more Zoroastrian Tajikistan and Caucasus, and no Ottoman expansion into the Balkans. 3. The Mongol expansion still happened. They just conquered way more land, expanding into the Balkans, India, and Indochina. The Mongol Empire also collapsed sooner as a product of this overextension. 4. The Black Death hits the British Isles a lot harder than it did in our timeline, leaving about 5 English people and maybe 1 Welsh woman. This paved the way for the French to turn England and a depopulated Wales into their first colony. Britain, except for Scotland, in the 1930s, is still under French dominion, basically doing what the UK did to Ireland, except the English are the Irish. The English are poverty-ridden, and England is a dystopian industrial producer for the French Angevin Empire. This is one of the most impressive feats of this scenario. It makes me root for the English. Again. 5. The mod sticks to its Europe fails epically prompt by having the European powers not succeed in genociding the Americas. Instead, Europe only manages to set up a few colonies, clutching to the east coast. Even those ventures didn't last long, though, as they did in our timeline, with new republics popping up in revolt, I'd say about a century earlier than we did on average. This set it up so no single continental hegemon in the north or south could be established, since all these settler colonial republics and indigenous confederacies found themselves with set borders on all sides, with states able to put up a fight pretty early into the scheme of things. The consequences of a Europe unable to squeeze as much wealth out of the Americas manifest in an inability to bully China and the Middle East into submission. Persia, Egypt, and China are great industrial powers in the 1930s. The rape of Africa still occurs, but to a far lesser extent, with many more independent entities than just Abyssinia. 6. Well, that's enough niceness. There were 2 major conflicts in the early 20th century, the Vesperian War and the Great War. The Vesperian War, which is what North America is called, started out as a Louisiana trying to pick on the Four Nations Confederacy. But the Four Nations were guaranteed by California, and so California declared war on Louisiana, and Louisiana was in a league with Virginia, and it goes on until, World War I style Great War of conflicting alliances. The Great War itself in Europe was a power struggle between the Angevins and the Holy Roman Empire, which still exists, as nations in Europe, India, and Africa aligned themselves with these power blocks. The wars were fought for far longer than World War I, with the Vesperian War lasting 5 years, 6 years, okay, from 1899 to 1905, and the Great War being 1917 to 1924. The artillery and other bombing equipment was far ahead of our world in Godspeed, resulting for the majority of the Ruhr, Flanders, and Catalonia being uninhabitable wastelands, still by the start of the game, which is 10 years after the end of the war. And managing these areas will be a gameplay feature. In fact, these two wars ripped up so much land, so many cities and environments, that the ash in the air has created a mini ice age, lowering the temperature by a Celsius or two.